Before arriving in my current happily stable work environment, I've worked at some kind of dysfunctional places. There's a certain sense of camaraderie that comes with being able to turn to a colleague with wide eyes that just ask, "Did that really just happen?" The trauma bonds formed in the intense heat of a dumpster fire are fierce. But despite any dysfunction, I've not taken to actively working on dismantling my employer. I tried to improve things until the very end before finally admitting defeat and moving on. But what happens when the group that's so angry about their employer are armed, trained soldiers? What happens when they gather with plans to assassinate their commander-in-chief? At Fort Stewart, Private Aguigui, the ringleader of an armed militia, scurried about on base, collecting like-minded soldiers and fomenting discord. Ultimately, his violent fantasies culminated in the murder of his wife and unborn child. Well, kind of. Arguably, a double homicide he orchestrated was the actual culmination, and the murder of his wife and unborn son was a mere stop along the way. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. Isaac Aguigui and his wife, Deirdre, both served in the Army and were stationed in Fort Stewart, Georgia. Deirdre worked as a linguist, fluent in both French and Arabic, but before joining the Army, she worked as a massage therapist in Salt Lake City. She was too rebellious for her Mormon family and had gone to live with an uncle. But massage therapy wasn't paying the bills, and Deirdre found her way to Uncle Sam's Army. Friends would describe their marriage as troubled, but they nevertheless found themselves expecting a baby boy due in the fall of 2011. Deirdre resolved to make the marriage work for their son. The two met 2 years earlier when they were cadet candidates at the preparatory school for West Point. Deirdre, 3 years older than Isaac, had tutored him in math and was charmed by him. Isaac was kicked out of the program shortly thereafter, after getting in a physical confrontation with another cadet who accused him of sleeping with Deirdre. You see, candidates were supposed to be single. Deirdre dropped out shortly thereafter in order to marry him. Isaac still enlisted in the Army, then went to basic training at Fort Huachuca, while Deirdre, who was already enlisted in the Army, deployed to Iraq. Isaac trained in military intelligence before being stationed at Fort Stewart. While he was there, while Deirdre was still in Iraq, he engaged in an affair with a 17-year-old minor, supposedly worried that Deirdre was having her own affair abroad. When Deirdre returned from Iraq following an injury sustained as a result of a mortar attack, she joined Isaac in an on-base apartment at Fort Stewart. As Deirdre neared her final uncomfortable trimester in the summer of 2011, she found that she and Isaac struggled to come together and find themselves on the same team. They'd gone to a concert together on the 4th of July, which had given her hope, but just 2 weeks later they were again struggling. Instead of helping to prepare the nursery, Isaac spent time whooping it up with his friends, or as the Army Court of Criminal Appeals described it later, cavorting with fellow soldiers. He had disappeared for the weekend, prompting Deirdre to send a confrontational text message asking why he kept doing that to her. You see, Isaac liked to party and made up for his youthful abstinence at Fort Stewart, and he wanted a weekend away to continue acting single. Isaac promised he'd start driving back from the trip to South Carolina. Instead, he went to a barbecue and played beer pong. Deirdre was fairly displeased with Isaac's decision-making. When he was finally on his way home, Isaac went with another soldier to acquire potassium iodide. Isaac had explained that he could kill Deirdre and get away with it. He said he wanted to use the potassium iodide as a substitute for salt for Deirdre. but another soldier testified she thought she remembered him explaining that it could be used to administer a lethal injection. Either way, according to a New Yorker article, Deirdre was allergic to potassium iodide. Isaac had told more than one person that he wanted to kill Deirdre and her unborn child. He told a fellow soldier that if she got rid of his wife and unborn child, who the parents had named Calvin James, he'd split the insurance proceeds with her. Legal Beagles, if someone offers to split the insurance proceeds for a murder, just go to the police. Don't dilly-dally, because it's just not a funny joke. Deirdre was not unaware of the friction in her marriage and had at least once connected with the lead victim advocate at Fort Stewart. The advocate described Deirdre's revelations that Isaac had started out verbally abusing her, but that it had escalated into physical abuse and sexual coercion. She alleged that Isaac was forcing her to have sex, not only with him, but also with his friends. After obtaining that potassium iodide, Isaac returned to Deirdre on July 17, 2011. He texted that 17-year-old he'd been dating before, "Baby, you want to know something sexy? I'm not working another day, baby. We'll have plenty of money. All I need is your body whenever I want it." Later, Isaac dialed 911 to report that his wife was unresponsive. Emergency medical personnel rushed to the residence and discovered Deirdre unconscious on the floor. They moved her to the hospital where she was pronounced dead, Calvin having died with her. As Isaac explained it, he'd returned at 3 p.m. and the two were consensually intimate, using handcuffs and other restraints. He said after they had sex, he took a nap, and that when he awoke, he found his wife unresponsive on the living room couch. He told CID that Deirdre asked him to buy that potassium iodide for her and pled with them to get to the bottom of whether it had caused her death. It's unclear whether he mentioned the supposed allergy in that conversation or had any explanation for why he was bringing home something his wife was allergic to. Isaac later called Deirdre's parents to deliver the devastating news. He went on to ignore them at her funeral. The day after her death, Isaac texted a neighbor that Deirdre had died of a blood clot that had traveled to her heart, but the autopsy hadn't even been started, much less completed with a report issued. In the time that followed Deirdre's death, he told another friend it was a blood clot. To another, he claimed it was a pulmonary embolism. To still another, he raged about Army healthcare, alleging medical malpractice and that Deirdre died because they gave her the wrong medicine. He said at least he'd been able to say goodbye when they briefly revived her following their error. The medical records, however, were clear. Deirdre had never regained consciousness. Rather inexplicably, Isaac told still another person that Deirdre died in a car crash. For all of his changing stories, it's worth noting that expert opinions weren't terribly conclusive or cohesive either. The autopsy noted a number of contusions on Deirdre's body, some of which aligned with supposedly consensual bondage, some not. The report classified the cause and manner of her death as undetermined. The medical examiner later explained that it was possible that Deirdre died of manual strangulation, whether by a carotid sleeper hold or otherwise. Another expert pathologist who reviewed the medical evidence said the evidence pointed to death by suffocation, but it could have been cardiac arrhythmia. A third expert said Deirdre died of manual strangulation with multiple blunt injuries. After Deirdre's death, Isaac moved back into the barracks and threw a kegger. A month after her death, Isaac and one of his friends hit up a strip club. Isaac either had dated or was dating two strippers, giving them thousands of dollars to allegedly help pay bills, and was partaking in smoking synthetic marijuana, snorting bath salts and cocaine, and dabbling in ecstasy consumption. Mind you, he was still active duty in the Army at that time. As he and his friend blew through Isaac's money at a strip club while hopped up on cocaine he'd purchased, the friend began to press him, wanting to know exactly what happened to Deirdre and where exactly the money they were spending came from. The friend testified later that Isaac wove a tale of deception. He said that he'd gotten Deirdre to agree to bondage and sex, but that once she was incapacitated, Isaac slipped a bag over her head and strangled her until she stopped breathing. He still took the opportunity to have sex with and sodomize his wife one last time. When the friend threatened to go to CID, Isaac responded that the friend was also implicated, that he'd take him down with him. For what it's worth, the friend later got picked up for and convicted for robbery. Others in Isaac's orbit wouldn't necessarily describe him as a stand-up guy. A number came to trial just to describe his frequent, uncharged misconduct. They spoke of a soldier who frequently used illicit drugs, including ecstasy and cocaine, who carried on extramarital affairs, and who physically fought with his wife. But it took years for the Army to classify Deirdre's death as a homicide and to pursue charges against Isaac. He was finally arrested on April 3, 2013 for Deirdre's murder. If you don't normally stick around for the Legal Beagle section, I'd suggest checking this one out to learn more about 2 deaths linked to Isaac that occurred between Deirdre's death and his arrest. Isaac pled not guilty to the murder of his pregnant wife. Nevertheless, he was convicted of premeditated murder and intentionally killing an unborn child at a judge-alone general court-martial. When the court-martial moved to the sentencing phase, the government presented a robust case, prompting the defense to request a brief recess. Following that recess, defense counsel rested without presenting a sentencing case. Following that recess, defense counsel rested without presenting any sentencing case. The judge inquired of Isaac whether he understood that he was entitled to present evidence in extenuation and mitigation, that he could testify subject to cross-examination, or even make an unsworn statement. Further, the judge clarified he should discuss those rights with his counsel. When the judge asked whether Isaac supported his counsel's decision to skip making a sentencing case, he confirmed that he did. He was sentenced to confinement for life without parole, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and a dishonorable discharge. On appeal to the Army Court of Criminal Appeals, Isaac argued prosecutorial misconduct and that he received ineffective assistance of counsel. That's a pretty hefty allegation to lob at defense counsel, and it's evaluated under a standard laid out in the United States v. Strickland. It is not easy to win on an ineffective assistance of counsel claim on appeal, but the ACCA determined that defense counsel was pretty dang ineffective in the fact-finding phase of the case, specifically highlighting failures to object to hearsay and what seemed to be a lackadaisical approach to the non-forensic component of the case. Defense counsel submitted sworn statements asserting the decision to refrain from objecting to hearsay was strategic. The ACCA opinion said the defense really fumbled the football on even the most fundamental and likely effective objection. But they determined that ineffective assistance of counsel was not prejudicial to Isaac because the judge was dialed in enough, and because there were enough non-hearsay statements about Isaac's desire to kill Deirdre and the confession he made to his friend at the strip club. Contextualized in the totality of the testimony, Isaac couldn't show that had his defense counsel objected at the objectionable hearsay, he would have a reasonable probability of a different verdict. The real problem for the ACCA is that counsel didn't put on any evidence in the sentencing phase, even though they alleged that this was in line with Isaac's decision to not put on additional evidence during pre-sentencing. The judge had questioned Isaac about all of that and had confirmed that Isaac understood the rights he was waiving. But the ACCA basically called defense counsel dum-dums, saying they were unfamiliar with, quote, the basic responsibility of defense counsel to decide what evidence to present on behalf of an accused. That had to be brutal for counsel to read. The ACCA also got big mad that defense counsel wrote such limited initial declarations that they felt the need to prepare and submit supplemental affidavits, albeit after the deadline and without permission to file them late. So late, in fact, that it was nearly a month after oral argument. The ACCA, if you couldn't tell, was really annoyed with defense counsel. Not so annoyed so as to name them in the opinion, but annoyed nevertheless. I feel like it's really uncommon to see the court annoyed with the defense counsel, so this was a really interesting read. Ultimately, the court concluded that defense counsel's failure to present a sentencing case was prejudicial to Isaac, and generally a signal of the breakdown in the adversarial process. It was up to defense counsel to decide whether to present a sentencing case. That decision wasn't Isaac's. That was something the judge made clear when making inquiries into the decision not to put on a sentencing case. When counsel was given the opportunity to submit an explanation, they offered no tactical reason for their decision-making. They just abdicated the decision-making completely. The ACCA kicked the case back for a sentence rehearing in 2016. I do see that he's had at least one writ petition denied in the intervening years, but I've had a hard time tracking down the results of that rehearing because Isaac got charged in another federal crime, and it really throws off the search results. 6 months after Deirdre's death, Isaac ordered the murder of 2 civilian teenagers from his role in the forever-enduring Always Ready gang, a militia that took root aboard Fort Stewart. The group was based in part on a game called Rainbow Six Patriots and focused on the fear that one day the government might turn on its citizens. But the discord that fueled the group stemmed from Isaac's annoyance that he had to serve 45 days of corrective training tasks, namely scraping gum from the sidewalks and cleaning out dumpsters, following his accidental discharge of a handgun. The group, operating under their acronym FEAR, planned a variety of acts of terror, from poisoning the Washington state apple orchards, bombing Forsyth Park in Savannah, Georgia, and assassinating then-President Obama. Isaac, who'd previously worked as a page in the RNC when hosted in St. Paul, disapproved of what he called Obama's socialist policies and that he campaigned as a black man. Isaac hoped to buy 90 acres in Washington state and to build a compound for his anti-government militia. He wanted his father, a former drill sergeant, to drill the militia on the weekends and to work towards the greater goal of overthrowing the U.S. government on July 17, 2031. In an audio diary, Isaac described himself as the nicest murderer you'll ever meet. When Deirdre died, Isaac was the beneficiary of a $400,000 life insurance policy and an additional $100,000 payout. As mentioned up top, Isaac spent some of that money at the strip club and on strippers. He also used those proceeds to procure a cache of weapons for the militia. He visited a childhood friend at a hunting supply shop in central Washington state and dropped $32,000 on 14 guns, including high-powered rifles. During one violent outburst following the death of his wife, Isaac tortured a stray cat, stabbing it, thrusting his hand down its throat to try and feel its beating heart, and ultimately chopping off its head. The violence and the collection of guns with which to commit violence did little to scare people away. 2 teenagers, Tiffany York and her boyfriend Michael Rourke, a recently separated soldier, threatened to expose the group. Rourke had previously benefited from his relationship with Isaac and allegedly had stolen between $10,000 and $30,000 from that insurance payout. He was aware of what the militia did, and he told his girlfriend about it. Isaac was the ringleader. He had targeted impressionable and troubled soldiers for recruitment to the group. During his short tenure in the Army, he faced his fair share of disciplinary issues and seemed to collect those who picked up Article 15s and other behavioral counseling. So, as their leader, Isaac and other members of the gang invited the teens to the forest to shoot tracer rounds that Isaac said he'd procured. Instead, the 2 were shot execution style, in a wooded area just off base. Ultimately, Isaac pled guilty to those murders and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The families of the slain teens filed a $30 million wrongful death suit against the Army, alleging it failed to properly investigate Deirdre's death, and that had the Army properly done so, their children wouldn't have been killed 6 months later. The government reached a $4 million settlement with the families. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestion and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we unpack permissive inferences. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.